Today, all Americans have the right to a decent education, the right to vote, and the right to pursue any job at all. But not that long ago, African Americans were denied basic rights and opportunities in the United States. America is supposed to be the land of the free, but for a large portion of its citizens, that simply wasn't true. But one man's example changed the future of our country, not just for African Americans, but for all Americans, inspiring millions in the process. His name was Martin Luther King, Jr. I hope you have your marching shoes on, kids. We've got some walking to do.
Where are we going?
We're following in the footsteps of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Our destination is freedom and equal rights for all Americans.
Wow! Martin Luther King spent his whole life fighting for civil rights.
Civil rights? What's that?
Here it is. Civil rights are the opportunities all Americans are entitled to under the law. The right to vote, freedom of speech, things like that.
Not too long ago, African Americans were not given the same rights as white Americans, so they had to fight for their civil rights. And Martin Luther King helped lead the battle to obtain equal rights and equal opportunities for all African Americans. Of course, Martin Luther King wasn't always aware of these issues. He was born in his grandparents' house in Atlanta, Georgia, on January 15, 1929. The Kings were a well-educated and deeply religious family. His father was a Christian minister, just like his father and grandfather before him. His mother played the organ for their church. Like other kids, Martin loved to play baseball, football, and play with his friends in the neighborhood. But one day, when Martin Luther King Jr. was 6 years old, his happy childhood changed. Martin's best friend was a boy whose father owned a store across the street from the King home. Yet when the boys reached school age, Martin's closest friend suddenly would no longer play with him. Hurt and confused, the young Martin Luther King finally asked his friend one day why he didn't play with him anymore. The boy's answer would stick with him for the rest of his life. The friend's father had demanded that he stop playing with Martin because Martin was black.
That's crazy. Why would he say that?
Martin didn't understand either. He thought he had done something wrong. But his mother wiped his tears and told him about the long history of African people in America. Starting in the 1600s, Africans were captured and brought to America in chains. They were enslaved and forced to work, often under brutal conditions. Generations later, the descendants of those first African people called America home. Yet they were still not completely free. After the Civil War, slavery was outlawed. But although slavery no longer existed, racism did.
Racism is the belief that certain characteristics, like the color of someone's skin, can make one person better or worse than another.
Exactly. And when Martin Luther King was a kid, African Americans were not treated equally or the same as white Americans.
Then Martin's friend's family was racist. They thought they were better than Martin just because they were white and he was black.
You're right. But Martin's mother told her son that no matter what, he should hold his head high, that he was as good as anyone else, that he was somebody. In the 1930s and 40s, when Martin Luther King was just a child, life was very difficult for most African Americans. African Americans were no longer enslaved, but in truth, they weren't really free. Many African Americans were denied good jobs. attended rundown schools, and lived in poorer neighborhoods than white people.
That's just not fair.
Yeah, I'd never put up with that.
You say that now, but sadly, there was nothing much you could do about it back then. There were laws that allowed these inequalities to exist. They were called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were designed to segregate blacks from whites. Segregate means to keep people apart from each other, which means that there were separate schools for white children and black children, separate swimming pools, separate parks, restrooms, waiting rooms, even separate drinking fountains. As long as things were separate but equal, the law said that keeping African Americans and white Americans separate was okay. But the truth was, while things were separate, they were far from equal. For example, white schools typically had plenty of books, nice desks, and pretty buildings. But black schools had to make do with very little. That meant that African American children might have to share what books were available and attend schools that were not very nice at all. The Jim Crow laws extended into every part of American society, particularly in the South, allowing whites to routinely mistreat and take advantage of blacks.
But why didn't African Americans attempt to change these laws?
Well, some people did, but it wasn't that simple. You have to understand that many African Americans believed they were powerless to change the system. If they tried to vote to change the laws, there were special rules to make it harder. Sometimes African Americans were required to pass a test to vote or pay a fee that most could not afford. So things stayed the way they were for years and years. Young Martin Luther King Jr. was aware of the racism around him and was determined to find a way to change things. As a bright student, King was accepted at the age of 15 into Morehouse College, a traditionally black school in Atlanta, Georgia. The summer before he began classes, King journeyed north to work on a tobacco farm in Connecticut. Like other northern states, Connecticut had no Jim Crow laws. The work was hard, but the way of life opened Martin's eyes. While racism did exist in the North, by comparison, blacks there had more freedom than those living in the South. When the summer ended and King returned to college in Atlanta, he once again felt like a second-class citizen, forced to ride in a separate train car and sit in a separate waiting room. King would later write that he could never forget the anger he felt at being treated differently just because he was black. In college, King thought about becoming a lawyer so that he could help to change the laws unfair to African Americans. Instead, by the time of his senior year at Morehouse, he had decided to follow in his father's footsteps and become a Baptist minister. He had always wanted to help other people and decided that the ministry would be the best way to fight the social problems around him. He went north again, this time to Crozier Seminary near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to study for the ministry. It was here that King learned about the life of Mohandas Gandhi.
Gandhi? I've heard that name before.
Mohandas Gandhi lived from 1869 to 1948 in India. At the time, India was ruled by Great Britain, and Gandhi would eventually lead a movement to make India independent that was unlike any other. Instead of leading his followers into a violent war, Gandhi preached nonviolence. He believed that major social changes could be made without the use of any weapons or any violent acts at all. It involved the use of something called civil disobedience.
Civil disobedience means disobeying laws that you think are wrong or cruel.
Correct, Sammy. Gandhi's followers stopped obeying British laws that they felt were unjust. The protesters were thrown into jail, but each time this happened, more protesters would step in to take their place. Thousands of Indians joined Gandhi in peacefully defying the British-run government, eventually bringing about independence for India. Gandhi's teachings deeply affected Martin Luther King. He didn't know how he would do it yet, but he knew he wanted to use Gandhi's approach to fight for social change in his own work as a minister. While King was continuing his studies in Boston, he met his future wife, Coretta Scott, who who also shared his views on the inequalities in the South. They married in 1953. Even though Coretta and Martin didn't want to return to the South, where they again would have to live under Jim Crow laws, they had a strong desire to make a difference where things were at their worst. So, in 1954, when he was 25, they moved south to Montgomery, Alabama, where King became the minister of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. That same year, African Americans won a major victory in their fight for equal rights. Let's get a report from the field.
This just in. Hi, Tracy. Reporting to you from the United States Supreme Court. The year is 1954, and the U.S. Supreme Court has just decided the case called Brown versus the Board of Education. It's a groundbreaking decision. The court said that segregation in schools is wrong. That means the court refuses to allow the separation of children into different schools based on the color of their skin. And from now on, it'll be illegal. That means that all schools will be required to teach both black and white children together. This is a major victory for all people in favor of equal rights. Stay tuned for more developments. And back to you, Tracy.
The court's decision on Brown versus the Board of Education was a major one, but many Southern whites still refused to obey the Supreme Court's ruling. And since white people in the South controlled the schools, the money, and the government, the situation seemed hopeless. A major battle for the civil rights of African Americans had begun.
I don't get it. Even though the Supreme Court was now on their side, black kids in some states still couldn't go to school with white kids?
Legally, they were allowed, but there were plenty of people in power who tried to stop black kids from attending white schools. It was a scary time. Some people were too afraid to stand up for their rights, but others worked up the courage and took a stand.
Or a seat, like Rosa Parks.
In 1955, Rosa Parks was a 42-year-old woman who lived in Montgomery, Alabama, like Martin Luther King. In Montgomery, many African Americans depended on the city bus system. And on those buses, if you were black, you had to sit in the back of the bus. If a white person wanted your seat, you had to give it up. It was the law.
This just in. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks got on the bus to go home from a long day working as a seamstress. And on this particular day, when a white man demanded that she stand up and give him her seat, she was tired, she was frustrated, and she had had enough. She looked up and said no. She refused to move. Because she wouldn't give up her seat to the man, Rosa Parks was arrested and thrown in jail. Back to you, Tracy.
In jail? For not giving up her seat? That can't be.
Well, like you, Sarah, many people in the community were outraged. Some black residents of Montgomery began planning a boycott of the city bus system.
What's a boycott?
A boycott is when people refuse to use or buy something. During the bus boycott that started in 1955, most African Americans refused to use the buses until the laws were changed. Many people were even willing to walk miles every day to and from work just to avoid boarding a bus and breaking the boycott. After the first morning of the boycott, those who took part decided to form an organization to continue the protest. They selected Martin Luther King Jr. to be the leader of the new group. King urged African Americans in Montgomery and elsewhere to join together to fight for equal rights. He also said that their protest must be nonviolent.
King used what he learned from Gandhi, that peaceful protest could change things that were unfair.
But remember, even though King and his followers were committed to being peaceful, there were many people who were not.
This just in. January 30th, 1956. Dr. Martin Luther King's home was bombed today by unknown persons. Dr. King's wife and infant daughter were home, but escaped the house unharmed. Fortunately, King was not at home. Back to you, Tracy.
At the end of the year, in November 1956, the Supreme Court again stepped in. They declared that segregation on the buses was illegal.
The boycott worked.
With a newfound sense of pride and accomplishment, the African American community was now ready to take on an even greater task: a nationwide struggle for civil rights, and Martin Luther King Jr. would lead the way. In 1957, King helped create a group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, to help him in the struggle. At the age of 28, King was in the thick of the battle for civil rights. Everywhere, African Americans were organizing for freedom. And many white Americans supported their effort to fight for equal rights. But the peaceful protesters faced incredible opposition from racist groups who used terror and violence as weapons against them. Even those who should have protected the protesters, the police forces of some southern cities, used violence to stop the protests. But King and his followers marched ahead. In February of 1960, Black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat and ordered lunch at a segregated drugstore lunch counter. In time, many others would follow, refusing to move until they were served. They called this peaceful form of protest a sit-in. Martin Luther King was very proud of them. He participated in a sit-in too, and was arrested and thrown into an Atlanta jail. A young politician named John F. Kennedy took an interest in King's case and helped to get him released from prison. Weeks later, in November of 1960, Kennedy would be elected President of the United States. In December 1960, the Supreme Court had outlawed segregation in train and bus stations all over the country. But in the South, nothing had really changed. So in 1961, a new effort was underway to call attention to how unfairly African Americans were being treated. Groups of young people, both black and white, boarded buses and set off to travel through the southern states.
They called themselves Freedom Riders.
They planned to test the new laws, which said that blacks and whites should be treated equally in bus and train stations by ignoring the whites-only signs at the stations they passed through. Let's get a report from the field.
This just in. At first, things went fine. But when they got to Alabama, racist mobs attacked the riders, and the police did nothing to help. Finally, the U.S. government sent police officers in to stop the violence, but they didn't prevent the Freedom Riders from being arrested and thrown in jail. Martin Luther King was disappointed and angry. He had hoped the government would understand what the Freedom Riders were trying to do. Back to you, Trace.
The civil rights struggle was in full swing now, and Martin Luther King knew he had the attention of the entire country. In 1963, he traveled to one of the most racist cities in the South, Birmingham, Alabama, to demand an end to segregation there. He and his nonviolent army of supporters planned to march through the city in protest. By the end of a week of protests, King and 300 others had been thrown in jail. On May 2nd, 1963, 1,000 children from Birmingham schools joined the march. But the unthinkable happened. Police Chief Bull Connor allowed his policemen to attack the children with dogs, clubs, and fire hoses. The news reports showed it all. Finally, people all over the country saw the ugly face of racism. They were outraged.
They were very brave, weren't they, those kids who marched?
Very brave. They knew it was dangerous, and what they did challenged President Kennedy to finally propose a law that would outlaw segregation once and for all. There was yet another march being planned by other civil rights leaders, the largest one yet. They were going to take their complaints right to the president's front door in Washington, D.C. It was called the March on Washington, and it took place in August of 1963.
This just in. I'm here reporting to you from the foot of the famous Lincoln Memorial. There are nearly 250,000 people here, black and white, from all walks of life and from all parts of the country. They're gathered to show the world their firm commitment to obtaining equal rights for African Americans in our country. And who's at the head of this incredible show of support of civil rights? You guessed it, Martin Luther King.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Back to you, Tracy.
On July 2nd, 1964, less than a year after Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, the Civil Rights Act was passed. King was there to see it signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The law was written to outlaw segregation based on race and ensure equal rights for everyone in all public places. Finally, a major victory.
In 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
The Nobel Peace Prize is given to the person who has done the most work for international peace. King was grateful for the award, but he felt he still had work to do. In 1965, when King was 36, he moved to Selma, Alabama. In this small city, King conducted a series of marches to the courthouse where he hoped to register thousands of African American people to vote. Every day for months, the marchers tried to register to vote. And every day, they were met with angry mobs, violence, and arrest. Finally, the marchers decided to walk to the state capitol in Montgomery, a trip that would take 4 days. There, they hoped that they could make the governor of Alabama listen to their cause. Instead of listening, the governor of Alabama allowed the police to attack the marchers. This day, March 7, 1965, became known as Bloody Sunday. Horrified at the violence, but determined to carry on, King himself led a successful march from Selma to Montgomery 2 weeks later. This time, President Johnson sent in troops to protect the marchers, and they marched into the Capitol, exhausted but victorious. As a result of their protests, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, which protected everyone's right to vote.
Martin Luther King was amazing. He went everywhere he was needed.
Yes, and he was needed next in Memphis, Tennessee, a trip that would sadly be his last. On April 4th, 1968, as he stood on his motel balcony, a gunshot rang out. Martin Luther King fell to the ground. An hour later, King died at a Memphis hospital, the victim of an assassin's bullet. He was 39 years old. People were shocked and saddened. How could this happen to such a peaceful man? Thousands and thousands of people, black and white, attended King's funeral to mourn the passing of a great man.
In 1983, the United States created a federal holiday to honor the life of Martin Luther King Jr. Each year, the third Monday in January is a time to remember how the work of Martin Luther King helped to change the lives of millions of Americans. And it's a day that inspires people to volunteer their time to help solve problems in their own communities.
But you don't need to wait for a holiday to remember how this great American impacted the way we live today. Martin Luther King's dream is very much alive, and his words will always be with us.
He really did serve all people, didn't he? His courage helped others to change the world. So it's up to us, isn't it, to keep his dream alive?